Basement room. The basement room is a scary tale about a family who experience a weird and disturbing supernatural presence in their cellar. Years ago, my family went on a vacation in Cape Cod and we rented a small old house to stay in for 2 weeks. On the main floor was the kitchen, the living room and a bathroom. The bedrooms were on the second floor. There was a basement room downstairs, with a washer and dryer, a sofa, and a television. On the first night, we were all awakened by a terrible scream from my sister's bedroom. When my dad burst into her room and turned on the light, he found her sitting up in bed, screaming and crying. My parents sat with her and comforted her until she finally calmed down enough to tell them what had scared her. She said that she had been awakened in the middle of the night by a horrible stench. When she opened her eyes, she had seen the entire bedroom soaked in blood from top to bottom. There was blood all over the floor, bloody handprints on the walls and blood spatter all over the ceiling. We all thought that she had just been having a nightmare, but she refused to go back into her bedroom and stayed in our parents' room for the remainder of the holiday. One evening, my mother was cooking dinner in the kitchen upstairs and my father had gone out on an errand in a nearby town. My sister and I were in the basement room, watching TV, when all of a sudden, the light bulb popped and the TV went off, leaving us in complete darkness. The basement was unfinished and had old stone walls, making it a bit of a creepy place. For a few seconds, we just froze, not knowing what to do. Then we started to smell something horrible. It was a terrible stench and when it hit our noses, we felt nauseous. It smelled like rotting flesh. The smell quickly grew worse and then we just heard a scratching in the darkness. Something seemed to be scratching at the floor or the walls. We screamed and began scrambling around in the pitch black, trying to find the door. Eventually, we managed to open the door and ran upstairs screaming to our mother. We kept telling her about the disgusting smell and we heard something scratching and scraping around down there. My mother eventually agreed to go down to the basement, replace the bulb and check out the source of the horrible smell. She took a flashlight and a new bulb and disappeared into the darkened basement as we waited for her at the top of the stairs. We expected her to return quickly, but she seemed to be down there for an eternity. Suddenly, we saw her emerge out of the darkness and come running up the stairs. She slammed the basement door behind her and bolted it as fast as she could. She turned to us and we could see her face had completely drained of color. Her eyes were wide with fear and she just said, "I don't want you going down there again." Then she went into the kitchen and called the police. We overheard her conversation on the phone and managed to figure out that she'd seen someone down in the basement room. As we waited for the police to come, we huddled together in the living room, staring at the basement door. At any moment, we expected to hear someone banging on it or trying to break it down. My mother refused to tell us what she had seen. When the police arrived, my mother greeted them at the front door and ushered them inside. She unbolted the basement door and they went down into the darkness with their flashlights out and their guns drawn. They searched the entire basement room, but found nothing. There was no other way out of the basement, no windows, no doors. Whatever was down there would have had to come up through the basement door. After the police left, my mother finally revealed what she had seen down there in the pitch-black basement room. As she spoke, she became very still and quiet. She said that she had been changing the light bulb downstairs when she began to smell the horrible stench we had described to her. Then she started to hear a faint scratching noise. She shone her flashlight around the room and suddenly caught sight of something crouched between the washer and dryer. It was a man, crouched on all fours. His clothes were tattered, his hair was wild and tangled, and his face didn't look human. It was twisted in an expression of pure hatred. In that split second, he looked up at my mother, his eyes reflecting the beam from her flashlight. Then he suddenly crawled forward and disappeared through a wall. When my mother saw him simply vanish into thin air, she dropped the flashlight and ran. After that, none of us would go down in the basement. We kept the door locked and bolted. Every night, we slept in our parents' room and locked that door too. We cut our holiday short a few days later and just drove home. Drain. Drain is a short, terrifying ghost story about a young boy who encounters something hideous lurking in a small room off his bedroom. It is believed to be a true story. When I was about 10 or 11, my family lived in a 3-story house. My bedroom was on the top floor. It was small, square, and simple. There was a glass door in my bedroom that led into a small brick room. This room had no ceiling, just an opening in the roof that extended to the open air. The brick room was empty except for a drain in the middle of the floor, likely installed to allow rainwater to drain away. There was something unsettling about the drain. Whenever I saw it, a wave of nausea would wash over me. Once, I even thought I saw the drain cover jiggle slightly when I opened the door. There was always a chill in the air when I opened the door to that little brick room. I only had the nerve to open the door in broad daylight, and even then, just to take a quick peek inside. Despite the blazing sun outside, the brick room was always deathly cold. The memory of what happened in that room still haunts me and plagues my dreams from time to time. Shortly after I moved into that bedroom, I started having very bad dreams. One night, I had a particularly horrifying nightmare and awoke with the feeling that something was terribly, terribly wrong. Immediately, my eyes darted to the door. I lay there in bed, afraid to move, but unable to look away from the door in case there might be something there when I looked back. That was when I first heard the whispering noise. It sounded like a wire brush softly rubbing against something. It wasn't coming from any discernible direction, but it seemed to gradually surround me like a blanket, pressing on my ears. Eventually, I managed to fall asleep, but the next morning, I swore I could make out footprints in the dust around the drain in the little brick room. After that, the whispering rarely stopped at night. It was always there, from the time I switched off the light until I finally managed to fall asleep. Often, I'd wake up in the middle of the night and find the room completely silent. Then, the whispering would start, as if it had just been waiting until I was awake. Over the next few months, the whispering continued. It was just a hollow, kish shaw haw hish ash, that seemed to repeat over and over. It didn't sound angry or sad. It was always just there, an eerie presence that never seemed to leave. Then one night, something happened that I still have nightmares about. It makes me cringe and want to curl up in a ball whenever I recall it. I awoke from a terrible nightmare. The moonlight was barely filtering in through the window. I looked at the door to the little brick room and that's when I saw it. To my utter horror, I could make out something lurking in there. As my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I saw that it was a woman. She had dark curly hair and pale white skin. Her eyes were completely black and filled with anger and hatred. Suddenly, she began shrieking and pounding on the glass door with both fists. Her head started swiveling around on her neck, shaking back and forth like a kettle on a stick. Her hair tossed around violently, and the skin around her mouth flapped loosely, giving me glimpses of her teeth and tongue. Saliva dripped from the corners of her mouth and flew off as she shrieked. I was terrified and all I could do was let out a high-pitched scream. As I screamed, she shrank back from the door and, slithered down the drain somehow. Her body was twisted and distorted, and I swear I could hear her bone splintering and cracking as she wound herself down into the drain. My father came charging down the hallway to my bedroom, thinking I was having a nightmare. When he got to the door, the drain lady was already gone. It was awful, and to this day, my father says he's never heard anyone scream so inhumanly before. I often ask him jokingly if he meant from me or her. The following nights were even worse. The whispering became more intense, almost as if it was trying to tell me something. I began to notice shadows moving in the corners of my room. Dark, shifting forms that seemed to melt into the walls whenever I tried to focus on them. One particularly dreadful night, I woke up to the sound of dripping water. At first, I thought it was just rain, but as I listened closely, I realized it was coming from the drain in the brick room. I gathered the courage to open the door and saw water pooling around the drain, despite it being a dry night. The water seemed to bubble up, and in the dim light, I could see shapes forming in the liquid. Faces with hollow eyes and gaping mouths, silently screaming as they swirled around the drain. I slammed the door shut, my heart pounding in my chest. The final encounter was the worst of all. I had fallen asleep with my head under the covers, hoping to drown out the whispering. In the dead of night, I felt a cold breeze against my face and heard the door to the brick room creak open. I peeked out from under the covers and saw the woman again, but this time she was not alone. Behind her were other figures, shadowy and indistinct, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. They moved towards me, their whispers merging into a cacophony of hissing sounds. The woman reached out, her fingers elongated and twisted. I was paralyzed with fear as she drew closer, her mouth opening wide to reveal rows of jagged teeth. Just as she was about to touch me, I let out a blood-curdling scream. My father burst into the room, the lights flicked on, and the figures vanished. He held me as I sobbed uncontrollably, trying to explain what I had seen. We moved out of that house shortly after, but the memories of those nights still haunt me. To this day, I cannot look at a drain without feeling a shiver of fear. The woman and her whispering companions are forever etched into my nightmares, a reminder of the horror that once lurked in the little brick room. Pendulum. The Pendulum is a creepy ghost tale about a child who hears strange sounds in the attic at night. When I was young, my mother brought me to visit my grandmother at the old farmhouse where she lived. At night, my mother would put me to bed in the upstairs room while she slept on the couch downstairs. Every night, as I lay awake in the darkness, I would hear an odd scratching noise in the attic. It was very slow and sounded like it was moving back and forth, like a pendulum. Back and forth, it would sweep across the ceiling. At first I was scared, but after a while I got used to it, and the slow, steady rhythm of the scratching would lull me into an uneasy sleep. A few years later, when my grandmother passed away, my mother and I were cleaning out her house. We were in the attic, moving some old boxes, when I noticed something in the middle of the wooden floor. Under the thick covering of dust that had collected over the years, there were visible scratches in the wood. Chuckling, I called my mother over and told her how, as a child, I often heard a scratching noise coming from the attic when I slept in the room below. My Moma's face grew pale and she gently took me by the shoulders. In a trembling voice, she told me that her father had lost his job in the Great Depression and could barely afford to feed his family. He came home one night and hung himself in the attic with a horse bridle. Apparently, at the last moment, he regretted his decision because he struggled to gain his footing and his flailing boots had scratched the wooden floor where he had hung himself. Elevator buttons. The Elevator Buttons is a scary story about 3 kids who get trapped in a lift that seems to have a mind of its own. When I was a child, my parents lived in an old apartment building that was 14 stories high. Like many buildings, it was built without a 13th floor. It went straight from the 12th floor to the 14th floor. However, the elevators still had a 13th button, even though it didn't work. There were 2 other kids, Terry and June, who were living in the building. We were the same age, we went to the same school, and the 3 of us often played together in the evenings. One day, while we were waiting for our parents to come home, we decided to explore the roof of the apartment building. We took the elevator to the 14th floor, where we found the door to access the roof. After a while, we grew bored and went back downstairs in the elevator. When we were halfway down, June realized that she had forgotten something. She left her coat on the roof. She hit the stop button, then pressed the button for the 14th floor. Suddenly, the elevator ground to a halt and beeped 3 times. The doors slid open and we realized we were stuck between floors. Terry was about to slide out through the opening when I grabbed him and held him back. I told him it was too dangerous. If the elevator started up again while we were getting out, we could be sliced in half. Instead, I jabbed at the emergency button. The elevator groaned again and the doors slowly slid shut with a clang. "What's going on?" asked Terry. I shook my head and replied, "I don't know." As we stood there shivering, the lights in the elevator suddenly went off and we were plunged into darkness. Then, one of the buttons on the panel lit up. It was the button for the 13th floor. None of us had pressed that button. It simply lit up by itself. It wasn't supposed to be able to light up. There was no 13th floor. To our complete and utter horror, we felt the elevator slowly move upwards. June jabbed the stop button, but it didn't work. We watched as the floors passed by. 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. There was a sound of scraping metal and the elevator ground to a halt. The doors slid open and we were staring into pitch darkness. All 3 of us huddled together in the elevator, too petrified to move. Just then, we heard a faint noise in the murky blackness. It made our hair stand on end. Squelch. Squelch. It was a wet and sticky noise. The kind of noise you get when you throw a wet cloth against the wall. Squelch. 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 It sounded like something soggy dragging itself across the floor. As we strained our ears to listen, trembling in fear, the sounds grew faster, gathering pace. Squelch. 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 There was a sickly, moldy smell in the air. It was like the stench of rotting meat. The sounds picked up pace, getting faster and faster. Squelch, 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 squelch. Just when it sounded like it was almost upon us, the elevator suddenly sprang to life. The doors began to close. The stench of death and decay was unbearable. As soon as the elevator doors shut with a clang, something smashed into them with a wet slap. The elevator creaked and began to go down. When the doors finally opened, we found ourselves on the ground floor. My father was standing there. When I saw him, I jumped up and embraced him. I still wonder what would have happened if he hadn't pressed the button to call the elevator at that exact moment.